Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today we're looking at this drone strike on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's residence.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation developing, and
We've got 3 news articles for you today, 2 from Indian sources and 1 from Al Jazeera, just to get, a little flavor from different parts of the world and how they're covering this.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see how the different outlets frame these events.
Yeah, and I think to really get into this, we have to sort of back up a bit because this didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
This is part of this larger conflict. And just 2 days before this drone strike happened, there was another pretty significant development in the whole Israel-Hamas conflict.
Right.
And I'm talking about the assassination of Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar.
Yes. Definitely a key event in this whole timeline.
That was huge.
Huge, absolutely. And, Sinwar was a very powerful figure in Hamas. And he was accused of being the mastermind behind that really devastating attack on Israel back on October 7th. And as I'm sure a lot of our listeners know, that attack led to, well over 1,200 deaths.
Yeah, it was awful. And after the assassination, the IDF released that drone footage of the strike that killed Sinwar. It's like, I don't know.
Talk about a power move.
Chilling is the word I was going to use.
Yeah.
Just chilling to see that.
Definitely a strong message being sent there.
And then 2 days later, this drone strike hits near Netanyahu's residence.
Right.
So the timing of this can't be a coincidence.
Yeah, it really makes you think,
right?
Like, what's the connection there?
What's going on?
What's the motivation behind that timing?
Exactly.
Because while, thankfully no one was hurt in that strike near Netanyahu's home.
Right.
It was still an incredibly bold move.
Yeah.
Imagine targeting the residence of the Israeli prime minister.
Right.
A place that, one would assume is heavily guarded. It really raises the stakes. Wow.
Absolutely. So speaking of high stakes and, kind of scary events, let's talk about what happened that morning at the residence.
Right.
Because early reports were saying that at least one drone actually hit the town where Netanyahu lives. And then on top of that, the Israeli military is saying that they had to intercept 2 others.
Wow.
That's
a close one.
Yeah. It was a very, very close call.
Yeah. And, even though early reports were saying no injuries, the images coming out of there painted a very chaotic scene.
Oh, I bet.
You've got ambulances, medical personnel. You can just tell it was a really intense situation.
So, with you moved this bold, someone has to be claiming responsibility for it.
Right. And it seems like almost immediately after the news broke, the Iranian military was reporting that Hezbollah was behind it.
Interesting.
And for those who don't know, Hezbollah is a pretty powerful political and militant group based in Lebanon. They have ties to Iran.
Right.
And they actually released what they claim to be footage of the drone strike.
Wow. So they're really stepping up and saying, we did this.
It seems that way.
Wow. And not only that, but our Al Jazeera article directly quotes the Israeli Prime Minister's office confirming that the drone came from Lebanon.
Interesting.
So you've got multiple sources pointing toward Hezbollah here.
Right, and that's why I think it's really fascinating that we have these different sources today because they're all coming at this from slightly different angles.
Right, and they're all saying it came from Lebanon, but they're framing it a little differently. So you kind of get this bigger picture.
Exactly, and it's so important to get those different perspectives because this is a very complex situation with a lot of different factors at play.
Absolutely.
And I think, as we dive deeper into these articles, we're going to see even more of those nuances emerge.
Oh, for sure. And I think that's a good place to stop for part 1.
That's good. Yeah, for sure. And, it's interesting because now we're dealing with the aftermath of it.
Right.
You've got the potential for retaliation.
Oh, yeah.
The wider regional implications. So it's
scary.
It really is. And this is kind of the thing about this conflict, right? It's got such a long and complicated history.
Right.
So any little incident like this just has the potential to escalate so quickly.
Yeah, like someone just lit a match near a powder keg.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin to unravel this? Where do we go from here? What are some potential outcomes? How can this impact, the region, the world?
Yeah, right. Well, let's start with Israel's potential response.
Okay.
One possibility, and I think maybe the most hopeful one, is a more measured approach.
Okay.
So, they might strike very specific, Hezbollah assets in Lebanon,
Okay.
focus on military infrastructure, try to minimize civilian casualties, like
Yeah.
a very pointed attack.
It's like a show of force, but not all-out war.
Right, exactly. A more, kind of surgical strike.
Right.
But on the other hand, Israel has a history of responding pretty forcefully to anything that it sees as a threat to its security.
Right. Especially considering that October 7th attack. I mean, that was devastating.
Right. That was a huge deal. So it is possible that we see a much, larger scale response.
Right.
Something that's aimed at really crippling Hezbollah's capabilities.
But wouldn't that risk pulling Lebanon even more into this conflict?
That's the big risk, right? That's the danger of escalation. It can be really unpredictable. You just don't know what's going to happen. What might start as a limited thing could turn into something much bigger.
Right.
And especially in a place as volatile as the Middle East.
And then on top of all of that, you can't forget about the human cost.
Absolutely.
I mean, the civilians who are stuck in the middle of this.
Always the innocent people who pay the highest price. And I think that's where the international community comes in.
Right. What kind of role do they play in all of this?
Well, they have a responsibility to try to de-escalate the situation, right?
Right.
So, apply diplomatic pressure, urge restraint from both sides, and really work towards some kind of peaceful resolution.
Because this isn't just a regional issue.
Exactly. This is something that the whole world is watching.
Yeah, and this whole region is already kind of on a knife's edge. You know what I mean?
It really is. You've got the war in Syria still going on.
Yeah.
You've got Iran and Saudi Arabia at odds. And of course, Gaza is always unpredictable.
And now with this drone strike, it feels like things just got like 10 times tenser.
Yeah, the stakes have definitely been raised.
Yeah, and it just really highlights how quickly things can change.
It really does. And that's why it's so important to stay informed about these things.
Right.
Look at all sides of the story, try to understand what's really happening.
Absolutely. So speaking of understanding all sides, let's bring it back to these articles a little bit.
Okay.
What are some of the key takeaways from the different perspectives that we're seeing here?
Yeah, well, if you look at the Al Jazeera article, for example, they really emphasize the fear and panic in Israel after the strike.
Okay.
Even mentioning people running for bomb shelters in Tel Aviv,
Wow.
which is pretty far from where this actually happened.
Yeah.
So it seems like they're really trying to paint this picture of a nation that's on edge.
Right, like everyone in Israel is terrified right now.
Exactly. And then you contrast that with one of the Indian sources that uses really strong language to describe Hezbollah.
Okay.
They actually call them Iran-backed terrorists.
Oh, wow.
Which, really frames them as the aggressors here.
Right, like there's no question about it.
Exactly. And it's just a good reminder that even the words that we use to describe these events can be really loaded.
Totally.
And they reflect a certain perspective.
For sure. So, I mean, taking all of this into account, what's the one big thing you want our listeners to remember about this whole drone strike and what might happen because of it?
That's a good question. I think the biggest takeaway for me is how interconnected everything is,
Right.
This drone strike, the assassination of Sinwar, the tensions that already existed in the region.
Yeah.
These aren't just isolated events. They're all connected.
Like that butterfly effect.
Yeah, exactly. One action can set off this whole chain reaction that we can't even predict.
Right.
And that's especially true in the Middle East.
For sure. So where do we go from here? What do you, I don't know what's on your mind as you're following this.
Right.
What are you looking for?
Honestly, I'm most worried about miscalculation at this point.
Okay.
Because things are so tense right now.
Yeah.
That any little misunderstanding, any mistake could have these huge consequences.
Oh, totally.
So I'll be watching to see how Israel responds, how the international community gets involved, and what Hezbollah does next?
So many moving pieces.
Right. It's like this really delicate dance.
On a global scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this drone strike just made that dance even more complicated.
Yeah. It's a scary thought, but it's the reality.
It is.
And
It's a reminder that conflict is still a very real threat in the world.
Absolutely. Well said. So, to our listeners out there, stay informed, think critically about what you're seeing and hearing, and don't be afraid to ask questions. This situation is constantly evolving, and we'll be here to break it all down for you.